We wanted to start by asking you about autism in terms of it being something that I think a lot of people in the United States have heard of. Perhaps most people know somebody with autism, but I don't think most people have a real understanding of what the spectrum is, how it affects people, and the different abilities that people on the spectrum can have. Can we start by you sharing with us uh, how you feel as though some people on one end of the spectrum might be different, where you feel as though your abilities fall in that, and how we can better help people understand truly what autism is?
Well, autism goes all the way from geeky and nerdy programmers out in Silicon Valley. They know they're on the autism spectrum, but they avoid the labels. One that's being kind of socially awkward and geeky become autism. There's no black and white dividing line. A brain can be more thinking and cognitive, or a brain can be more social emotional. Well, on autism, you get more on the thinking side, but it's a whole continuum. And there's a paper called Genomic Trade-offs, Autism and Schizophrenia, the Steep Price for a Human Brain. The same genes that make humans have a gigantic big brain are the same genes involved with autism and schizophrenia. They're actually opposite disorders. In autism, you might get too many nerve cells growing back in the math department or the graphic design department. And in schizophrenia, you get a skippy, the network's too skimpy, falls apart later on. But autism goes all the way from maybe Michelangelo. Einstein had no speech until age 3. Now we can argue about whether he'd be autistic, but he'd definitely be in special ed today. Einstein had a lot of autistic traits. Thomas Edison, a bunch of different people. Tesla, the inventor of the electric dynamo for generating power. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have somebody that remains nonverbal. Maybe they have epilepsy on top of it and have difficulty controlling their movements. So you get this gigantic spectrum, and they keep changing the diagnostic guidelines. But basically, on the milder ends, it's socially awkward, but oftentimes really smart. And the skills tend to be uneven. Like I'm an object visualizer. I'm very good at visual things, designing things, artwork. And a lot of people with my kind of thinking are very good with the mechanical stuff and fixing things. Then you have your mathematical mind. Those are going to be your programmers that bring us the technology we're using now. And then you got the guys who like words. And so it's a very, very big spectrum. But if you didn't have a little bit of autism, we wouldn't have computers today. It's that simple.
You just mentioned some of the greatest minds to ever live, some of the greatest artists, the greatest inventors. I interviewed a mom who has 2 boys with autism, and she said something to me that has never left me. She says, I think the world needs more people with autism, or at least more people who are willing to come out and say that they have autism, because these people are so instrumental in building our society. What do you think about that?
Well, a person with autism, social isn't what makes the world go round. What makes my world go round is figuring things out. I like problem solving. That's something I get. I've replaced emotional complexity in my life with intellectual complexity. Again, as I said before, the brain can be more the thinking or cognitive or more social. So I would say half the population goes more on the social side, but then the other half of the population will go from slightly geeky to very, very severe autism. It is a true continuous trait. Many different genes contribute to it. There is no autism gene. There's a whole bunch of brain development genes, the same ones that make our brain big, that are also risk genes for autism. In fact, I've had my entire genome scanned. It's published now. And things like a blood disorder I have, where I have to be very careful about taking blood thinners. That showed up. Simple genetics. My teeth are terrible. My skin is terrible. That showed right up. That's simple genetics. And I'm glad to know about the bleeding thing, because if I get too many blood thinners during surgery, I could die from that. But it's a true continuous trait. It's not like having COVID or you don't have it. You see, in its milder variants, I think it's just a personality variant. In the more severe variants, yes, you're dealing with very severe disability.
Why do you think then, I'm a new mom, and I hear at the pediatrician all the time about what signs to look for to see if your child's autistic. Why do you think then that so many new parents especially are so concerned about having the diagnosis of autism placed on their child, when, as you said, there's such a spectrum that people can fit within. And some of these individuals are responsible for the art and the technology that we now take for granted every day.
I think on the milder end of the spectrum, it holds them back. Now, later on in life, the socially awkward person, can get insight from a diagnosis and help them with the relationships. But I'm seeing too many smart kids that aren't learning shopping. I'm seeing kids growing up that have never used tools. I've worked with very big, large companies building big plants in the meat industry. I've been involved with heavy construction for 25 years, and I'm very concerned with losing skills. We're losing what I call the clever engineering department. These are the people that can build very clever equipment. Can't do algebra, but build super clever mechanical devices. And even the state-of-the-art chip making machine for electronic chips is now made in Holland. And I think it goes back to they've kept the skilled trades, so they don't stick their nose up at it. Now you have the mathematical minds that go out to Silicon Valley, but they're short on programmers right now. Well, because the kids that ought to be making the next computer stuff, they're playing video games in the basement. Because I see kids on the mild end of the spectrum getting kind of trapped in the label. They become the label. And that's the reason why the Silicon Valley programmers avoid the label. They don't want to be identified. They don't want to be totally associated with it. See, this is the problem. And in the US, at least, you have to have a diagnosis to get any kind of service in the school, even if it's just a little tiny bit of extra reading tutoring.
I'd love to talk to you about what's happening in the schools today. But first, when we talk about the breakdown of boys versus girls being diagnosed with autism, as I understand it, boys are far more likely to be diagnosed, but girls get the diagnosis far later in their adolescence, or at least later than boys do. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be, why there is that discrepancy between boys being diagnosed more, but for girls, it's not being picked up as early?
Well, and the signs aren't quite as obvious. Now, of course, if you have delayed speech, obviously, someone knows they're wrong. And what used to be called Asperger's was basically socially awkward, but no delayed speech. And boys have more issues with some of those other things too. But I get asked all the time, has autism increased? I think a lot of it's increased detection. Also, compared to my generation growing up in the 50s, kids are not being taught social skills in the same structured way that every child in the 50s was taught. Sit at the table, say please and thank you, have manners. That was taught. And that's the reason why I'm seeing lots of grandfathers come up to me and they've had a good job and they find out they're autistic when the kids get diagnosed. Granddaddy had a paper route at age 11. The other big problem today is not learning work skills. That's the other really big problem. These grandfathers all had childhood jobs.
I've heard you say that these kids need to be pushed. They need to be, well, I'll let you explain that. What do you mean when you say
what you want to do is you want to stretch them and give them choices. Now, don't throw them into something that's going to be a failure. I'll tell you, multitasking, can't do that. Another thing I can't do is remembering long strings of verbal information. So if you want to get me fired, here's my nightmare job. Waitress in a super busy restaurant where I've got to balance plates on my arm. I'm going to drop them. And I have to remember 8 dinners without writing anything down. Or super crazy, busy takeout window. But now some other jobs like doing design work or the people that do programming, that doesn't require multitasking. But that we have to make sure that we put them in things where they can succeed. And a lot of multitasking and a lot of noise and stuff like that, that can often be a problem. But when I was working on the building of these big factories, I'm going to estimate that 20% of the skilled trades, brilliant machinery designers, drafting and drawing people were either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. And they are not getting replaced. We are losing skills. And we got more messes like 4 different types of power sources froze over in Texas. I'm going, you got to be kidding. Visual thinkers like me, I'm going, really? A coal-fired power plant and the turbine froze? Oh, you've got to be kidding.
Let's talk about
you see, you need the different kinds of minds, and we're getting more of these kind of problems, electrical power issues. We need people that can fix these things.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the education that these children and ultimately these adults are getting. Do you feel as if, at least here in the United States, it's adequate? Do you think it's servicing these
We're
kids
doing,
as they need to be?
we're doing a much better job with the little kids. Little kids are where we're doing a good job. Early intervention. Where we're falling down is with the teenagers not learning job skills, not learning life skills. And the other thing we need to do in the schools is put all the hands-on things back in: music, cooking, sewing, theater, shop, welding, auto mechanics. Because if you have these things in the schools, then these kids get to experience more things that they could turn into a career. You know, if you don't experience a musical instrument, how are you going to know you like it? You don't experience building things. How do you know you're going to like it? We got kids growing up without tools. And then your more mathematical mind kids, they become your degreed engineers. And they'll go out to Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley's short on programmers right now. I've been following the job market really carefully. They're down in the basement playing video games. We've got to get the video game playing under control. It's like a drug. Some kids, they get talk to their friends over a video game. I do not want to totally get rid of that, but they can't be doing it for 8 hours a day. And the people I worked with, they're all retiring. I mean, I know a guy who stutters, ADHD, dyslexic, rotten student, took a welding class, owns a metal fabrication company, owns. And another guy, he has a food factory that's all wall-to-wall stainless steel, and I've been on his jet. And we had a discussion about what label he would have been as a kid. He would have been every label in the book. And he started out washing equipment, then he started fixing and making it.
Let's talk about your upbringing. You mentioned earlier about schizophrenia, but as I understand it, when you were little, the term being used was infant schizophrenic. Is that?
Oh, yeah, that was such nonsense, because if you look at the neurology, autism and schizophrenia are actually opposites. What you see, it has to do with the proliferation of brain cells when you're building a big brain. All these stem cells are got to grow like crazy. And in autism, you get extra circuits, maybe in the math department or the art department. Schizophrenia, you don't build enough circuits. The network's too weak. And that's why it falls apart in late adolescence. They're opposite disorders, but they both have to do with development of a large brain. Making a big brain is a messy thing. And when I was a little kid, I had delayed speech, no speech delayed 4. I had very good early intervention. My mother found the right place for me to go to. I did not read when I was 8. Sight words did not work for me. Mother homeschooled me with phonics. But I want to make it very clear, don't shove phonics down the throat of a sight word learner, you'll mess them up. Use the method that works. But I'm concerned that a lot of these kids are just going nowhere, and they're not getting exposed to enough stuff to find out what they want to do. I absolutely cannot do algebra. That is screening kids out of skilled trades. That's ridiculous. I can do my old-fashioned 50 style up through 6th grade arithmetic, and that's all I need. Size hydraulic cylinders, I better know how to find the area of a circle. I know how to do that.
So it was your mom. It was your mom that believed in you. It was your mom that believed that you had abilities that had not yet been realized.
Well, and she encouraged my drawing ability. When I got to be about 8 years old, same time when I could not read, she could see that I was really good at drawing, and she encouraged me to draw lots of different things, to use different media. Take that thing the kids are obsessed with and build on it, expand it. He likes dinosaurs. Let's work some math into dinosaurs. Let's work some biology into dinosaurs. Use that motivation and expand on it.
How many years of this type of intervention from your mom did it take before you got to a place where you, her, your family, they were sort of comfortable with the way that your education was going, with the way that your abilities were developing?
Well, I did very good in elementary school. I went to a small elementary school. I was not bullied because the teacher explained to the other children that I had a disability that wasn't visible, like a wheelchair or leg braces or crutches. And high school was a nightmare. Regular high school, absolute nightmare. I got kicked out of high school for chucking a book at a girl who bullied me. Ended up going to a special school. And for 3 years, I didn't do any studying, but I ran their horse barn. Very expensive school of horse barn management. And Mr. Patey, the director, said, let her get through her adolescence. But you know what? I was learning how to work. The other big problem I'm seeing with kids with labels, they're not learning any working skills. I'm seeing kids that are 16 years old and they're really smart, doing great academics. They've never gone shopping by themselves. I was doing that at 7 and 8 years old, just like every other kid in the neighborhood.
Was it that class that helped lead you to your love of livestock and your connection with livestock?
It's all about exposure. When I was a teenager, that's when I was exposed to livestock. One of the things that's just so important is exposure. Let's look at Michelangelo. I've got his autobiography right here. Cheryl gave this to me, and I'm really glad she gave that to me. And when he was a young kid, he's a 6th grade dropout. He did not want to study Latin. He did not want to do law. Study Latin. Well, all around where he lived, they were doing art in the churches. So he was growing up in an environment where there was art all over everywhere. And the family that raised him were stone cutters. So he was introduced to the tools. You see, you've got exposure there. Hadn't had that exposure, it wouldn't have happened. And that's true for so many things. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about taking out all the hands-on classes and stuff, because I know a lot of kids aren't getting exposed to enough stuff to find out what they might want to do. Now, all the schools I were in had theater. I didn't care about acting in the plays. I did costumes and sets. The one thing I did do in my high school, we had the play Trial by Jury, and I made all the jury boxes, and the judges stand out of big cardboard boxes, and I painted them to look like wood.
Let's talk about the pandemic. If there's one thing that we have heard repeatedly over the last year, it's that kids, especially those who have different abilities, are just not faring as well as other kids that perhaps don't fall within the spectrum. They're not getting the services that they need, and they're just not connecting with their therapists or teachers the way they need to be. What are you hearing?
Big problem. Now, one of the things that's helped me, and I've done this ever since the pandemic started, I get up in the morning, shower, dressed for work by 7:30. No slouching around in jammies. Can't emphasize that enough. That's what they do in the space station. They get up, they have their work they got to do in the morning, their chores, their maintenance, and their experiments. Then they have a midday meal. Then they got to exercise, a whole lot of exercise. And then they have time off. Then they have their time off. NASA learned that they had to have that. When they did the first old Skylab, they overworked them and they got mad and they shut off mission control. But there's some things that were learned up there in a space station that I think apply somewhat to the pandemic. Now that we're getting our seniors vaccinated, now we need to get these kids back into school. They need to, especially younger kids, need to get them back in school. Now, if you have an unvaccinated senior in the house, yeah, I'm concerned about that. But now we're hopefully getting the vaccines out there to the seniors. And we have a little nursery school across the street from where I live, and I'm so happy to see the kids there. It's so much fun. I watched a little 2.5-year-olds riding little tiny trikes yesterday. And there's some of the parents are afraid to bring their kid back there. No, the kids need to be there and socializing normally with other little kids.
You wrote a book on autism in lockdown, or at least a pamphlet that I saw on your website, where parents can also ask you questions.
Well, this is my autobiography, Thinking in Pictures. That's my autobiography. It just came out, the new 25th edition. And this is my book, The Way I See It. Lots of little short chapters, just real practical information. And this is my book of kids projects, Calling All Minds. And in April, I've got another book coming out called Outdoor Scientist, because we need to get kids out doing the things we did in the 50s, like go study insects. And 50s upbringing was structured meals, learn your manners, and then go outside and play and have lots of fun and make up your own games. And the grown-ups would just keep an eye to make sure you didn't do something really stupid and dangerous.
Are you hearing about a lot of kids, though, that have regressed during the last year? Kids that were making such strides that are now pulling back because they're not getting the same sort of in-person, face-to-face services that they were before this pandemic?
It's a problem, and the parents are just frazzled, and no, it's a big problem. And now that we're getting some vaccine out, let's get some volunteers to come in and help with some of these kids, because we're getting our seniors vaccinated, and they're the most vulnerable population. Because we're getting into some really bad problems. I read a hideous article in the Wall Street Journal, teenage boys going out and carjacking. In other words, stealing cars with a take a car away from somebody by putting a knife in their face. Some police association said, well, these boys don't got too much time on their hands. I was just shocked. That was about a week ago I read that.
As I hear you talk about your upbringing, where you started, and certainly seeing you where you are now, what a remarkable story, just the different twists and turns of your life. Somebody who, at a young age, it took her mom believing in her to get the services that she needs. And now you are the person that people look to for guidance, for support, for answers, for direction.
Mother also kept stretching me. Mother homeschooled me in reading. And first of all, let's start with the book that's worth reading, like The Wizard of Oz. She always gave me choices. She had a very good sense of what I could do and stretch me just slightly outside my comfort zone, not throw me into a bunch of multitasking. And then another important mentor was Anne out at the ranch. If I hadn't gone to the ranch, there would be no cattle industry. And I learned to drive out on the ranch. That's going to take a lot longer. I did 200 miles on dirt roads before I did traffic. Then there was Mr. Carlock, my science teacher, another important mentor. And then another mentor out in the industry was a man named Jim Uhl. He was starting a small construction business out of his house. He'd just gotten out of the Marine Corps. He was a former Marine Corps captain, and he seeked me out to design things for him because he saw some of my drawings, and he helped me get my business started. He was another really important mentor. Mentors are extremely important. And I was just talking to some people that have a kid that's good at math. And I said, if his math is really, really good, and you show that to some college professors, they're going to want to work with them. The other thing I learned in my work was to show off my work, sell my work, not myself. An interview for me is to lay the drawings on the table. I would just put the drawings right out there. Now I've got them here in my book, and I would just show off the drawings, and people would go, wow, that's how here's some of my drawings. I used to just lay them out on the table. I would sell my work, not myself. Now, the problem is if you take out all these different things like music and sewing and cooking and woodworking and theater, welding, auto shop, well, then the kid doesn't have a place to show where he's able to do something because he's not exposed to enough stuff. I can't emphasize enough the importance of exposure to different things like musical instruments or art or building things.
In terms of building things, tell us a little bit about your inventions and how they have changed the world.
Well, when I was a little kid, I spent hours tinkering with a little bird kite that I have in this book, hours and hours. I was maybe in second grade trying to get this little bird kite to fly. And a lot of kids today are too concerned about making a mistake. And so I liked making things, and I'd spend a lot of time on tinkering with things. And then I started going out to cattle feed yards, and I noticed that cattle would refuse to walk through a chute if it had a shadow on it, or there was a coat on the fence. Other people didn't notice this because at the time I did this, I thought everybody thought in pictures the same way I did. And the HBO movie, Temple Grandin, shows exactly how I think. And other people weren't noticing that the cattle balked at a coat on the fence because they tend to be more verbal thinkers. I thought everybody thought the same way I did. And so I would design something and then I'd write about it. There's a lot of people out there that are super good at teaching, that do a lot of innovative stuff in education, but they don't write about it. I wrote about my stuff, and I just wrote about how to do it. And then the projects were shown really accurately in the movie. And one of the things that motivated me to do those big dip fat projects is I wanted to prove I wasn't stupid. Really, really, really big motivator. And then the way I sold Cargill, I designed the front end of all the Cargill plants in North America, is I sent the head of Cargill a big fold-out drawing, pictures, trade magazine articles, and 30-second wow. And he hired me to lay out the first big plant building they were doing. But I'm concerned that we've got too many smart people just getting shunted into special ed because they don't fit in the square peg in the round hole kind of thing. As I worked with those people, and a lot of them were brilliant, and they're not getting replaced. How about a poultry processing plant, state of the art, 100 shipping containers from Holland. I'm talking high wage country here. I'm not talking t-shirts from China or whatever. I'm not talking that. I'm talking high wage, very expensive equipment, very expensive to ship it here. It goes back, we're losing the skills. I've watched it happen. We got to bust some of these kids out of this autism silo.
Lastly, Professor, I'd like to know, of all the things you've done in your life, there have been so many. Your life has been so beautifully well-rounded with so many different twists and turns. Is there one thing that you are most proud of? Is there one thing that you are most happy to be known for?
Well, I worked on developing the guidelines for animal handling and animal welfare in big meat packing plants. It's used around the world. And people ask me, what do you plan to do now at the age of 73? I kind of think what I want to do now, I want to encourage the kids that are coming up now, whether they tend to go the art route, mechanical route, go computers, whatever, creative writing, theater, whatever they go into, help those kids to be successful. I'm seeing too many kids hold up in their room playing video games. And that's not good. And it makes me very happy when I have a parent write to me and they say, oh, my kid bought a house, he got married, I had him get a job. Now, I want to emphasize, when I say stretch, I'm not talking to throwing them into like that waitress job in that super busy restaurant. That's a job I could not do. So I cannot multitask. I dropped the dishes because I'm a bit klutzy, and I couldn't remember 8 dinners without writing it down and all their sides. I have almost no working memory. So I had to go into something where I could use the long-term picture memory that I have. And another kid, it might be his math memory. And then you have individuals that are nonverbal with other problems. See, this is the problem. We got a label that's going across a ridiculously large continuum. Because at one end, I think it is sort of a neurodiverse personality variant. But at the other end of the spectrum, you've got somebody who can't dress themselves. Maybe they have epilepsy and other medical problems on top of it, and it's still labeled autism.
I think the thing that people probably know best is, as you said, the squeeze is your invention, because it's been, I think, used in so many different ways for so many different people. It's really, as I understand it, changed the game in terms of how people approach and understand those with autism, how they respond to them when they're in distress.
Well, sensory issues are a big problem for autism, for other learning differences, also head injury. People have head injury where they've been head trauma, also can have sensory oversensitivity. Is extremely variable. And my sensory oversensitivity was touch sensitivity. And for a lot of people, deep pressure over wide areas of the body is calming. And I got that idea from a cattle squeeze chute. But I want to emphasize it does not work for everybody. Then there's other people on the spectrum, they have visual sensitivity problems, and they'll see flicker of fluorescent lights. Now those are getting phased out, but now we have all the new electronic lights. Some flicker, some don't. The problem is I don't know which ones are the bad ones. But you can have a situation where the room will be flashing on and off like a strobe light, and a person's not going to be doing very much learning in that situation. So sensory problems are real, and they're highly variable.
Can you take us through how you thought of the idea of the squeeze, how the cattle sort of brought you to this place where you can develop that, invent it, and then sell it to everybody else?
I was out of my aunt's ranch. Okay, I'm an Easterner. First time I went west, and there was a cattle squeeze chute on the next door neighbor's property. We were driving back from shopping, and we stopped by and watched them vaccinate some cattle, and they squeezed the cattle in there to hold them for their vaccinations. And I noticed that they just kind of relaxed, so I went and tried it. And then I went and built one for myself, and then I made it nicer with padding on it. But it was getting the idea from that. And then there's all kinds of devices now. Thunder shirts for dogs, helps on separation anxiety. Weighted blankets, weighted vests. I want to emphasize, though, it doesn't work on everybody. It only works on a subgroup that tend to be deep pressure responders. People are always looking for the single magic whatever. I'm going to say work on areas of strength. There's too much emphasis on areas of deficit. I've seen a kid they make them take algebra 3 times and keep them out of auto shop. Well, that's just stupid. You need up through 6th grade 50 style arithmetic for auto shop, even now. You know, the way they used to teach it. I did fine on that. But I'm in the weird position where I've talked to people in the education world, the autism world. I've worked for years in the industrial world, working out, you know, shops. And we need all the different kinds of skills. Let's take the Mars lander. Did you see those fabulous pictures of landing on Mars? Well, okay, the mathematicians figure out how to get it there. But when you look at those pictures, you go back and look at those pictures. Every part on that thing somebody made in a shop. They don't get enough credit for it.
And to your point,
you need to have the whole team. Now, NASA did do a nice write-up on one guy that did some parts for the earlier rover, but you have to have the whole team. You need the visual thinkers. Take the iPhone. Steve Jobs was an artist. That's why the iPhone's easy to use. The mathematician minds had to program it. You need to have both. And some of the coders, I read this book called Coders, they kind of stick their nose up at interface people. But the reason why Zoom took over everything is because it was easy to use. And it's also not a bandwidth peg like some of the other programs.
All right, Professor, if there's anything else that you would like to add, I'd be more than happy to give you the last word and let you do that. Thank you so much for your time, though. This was a wonderful conversation.
Well, I want to help kids that are different. You know, just be successful, be everything that they can be. There's different levels of abilities, and let's emphasis on what they can do. I'm going to end with Stephen Hawking's quote to the New York Times right before he died. He said, "Concentrate on the things your disability does not prevent you from doing well." He could do one thing well, math in his head. So that's what he did.
Incredible. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your wisdom. And it's just a real treat to be able to chat with you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.